Episode 16, Asia in an Era of Change. Question 1. How did the first voyage of Vasco da Gama affect the Portuguese strategy moving forward? How would Portugal assert control over the Asian maritime trading network? When Vasco da Gama first reached Calicut in 1498, he found a highly sophisticated, cosmopolitan trading world. Arab, Indian, and East African merchants operating freely under local rulers. Da Gama expected to find Christian allies and pliant markets. Instead, he encountered powerful Muslim traders, organized commercial networks, and rulers who viewed the Portuguese as unsophisticated newcomers. His cargo of textiles and trinkets represented the best that Europe had to offer, but was unimpressive when compared to Asian pepper, silk, and porcelain. Da Gama was receiving a first-hand education in precisely how far behind Asia Europe actually was. Da Gama used what little gold he had with him to buy spices, and such was their value that even such a meager amount turned a substantial profit. Da Gama's return excited Europeans at the prospect of direct involvement in the spice trade, but brought along with it a clear message: peaceful trade alone would not win a foothold. After Da Gama's voyage, the Portuguese crown decided that profit would require military and naval superiority. They began sending heavily armed fleets with the explicit goal of coercing cooperation through force, intimidation, and blockades. Portuguese expeditions would use cannon and naval bombardment to cow previously defiant ports. Instead of conquering large territories, the Portuguese focused on controlling key ports and sea lanes, what historians call a quote-unquote trading post empire. They established outposts such as Goa in India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Macau in China, and Nagasaki in Japan, in addition to several locations on the east coast of Africa. These were not standard colonies, but fortified bases from which the Portuguese could police and tax maritime trade. This turned the Indian Ocean from a free trade zone into a regulated monopoly enforced by brutal naval power. Portugal's gunpowder and ports strategy was highly effective in the short term. For almost a century, it allowed a small, underpopulated European state to control possibly the richest trade network in the world. But the empire was brittle, depending on superior ships, cannon, and terror, not on deep local integration. As larger and more adaptable powers like the Dutch and English East India Companies entered the region in the 17th century, Portugal's relatively unsophisticated system couldn't compete. Vasco da Gama's first voyage revealed that commerce in Asia could not be mastered through commerce and diplomacy alone. It would require force and fortresses. In doing so, Portugal created the first European maritime empire in Asia, small in manpower, vast in reach, and profoundly transformative in how Europe would engage with the wider world. Question 2. Why did the Portuguese domination of the Indian Ocean spice trade ultimately decline? Despite beating their European rivals to the mark, the Portuguese were only able to enjoy dominance of the Indian Ocean spice trade for about a century. The collapse of their empire was not due to a single factor, but rather to a combination of structural weaknesses, competition, and overreach. Portugal was a relatively tiny kingdom of 2 million people, and yet had to administer to an empire stretching from Brazil to Japan. Consequently, its administrative apparatus in Asia was chronically understaffed and underfunded. Its ports and fleets required constant maintenance, but the Portuguese crown lacked both the manpower and revenue to sustain them. Furthermore, the long distances between colonies meant communication could take a year or more, making centralized administration a logistical challenge. Officials were underpaid and essentially undersupervised, a recipe for private trade and smuggling. Captains and governors often enriched themselves rather than enforcing the royal monopoly. Local Portuguese commanders acted as de facto independent princes, further diminishing centralized authority. The corruption turned what had been a cohesive trading post empire into a patchwork of semi-independent outposts. The Portuguese initially succeeded because they had faced fragmented opposition, but as regional powers reorganized, the balance shifted. The Ottoman Empire established itself in the Indian Ocean in the mid 1500s. The various Indian states began building up their naval capacity, allowing them to restrict Portuguese privileges. And in Southeast Asia, a procession of local powers launched successful attacks on Portuguese outposts. By the late 16th century, Portugal's empire was under siege from multiple directions. The real death blow came from the Dutch and the English in the early 1600s. The Dutch, with superior ships, gunnery, and corporate organization, systematically displaced the Portuguese from the most profitable spice producing areas, especially the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands. The English focused their efforts on India, where they supplanted the Portuguese in a similar fashion. Both states projected their authority through joint stock trading companies, giving them the deep financial backing and flexibility that the state-run Portuguese empire had lacked. The newcomers were more efficient, more ruthless, and better financed, and they exploited Portugal's stagnant bureaucracy and outdated tactics. Finally, the world economy itself changed. The spice trade declined in relative importance as the global economy diversified to include cotton, sugar, silver, and tea, and the Portuguese tactic of controlling strategic choke points began to crumble under the volume of trade now occurring. Portugal's decline in the Indian Ocean was structural, not accidental, resulting from a coincidence of overextension, corruption, resistance, competition from European rivals, and global economic shifts that rendered the narrowly focused Portuguese model increasingly irrelevant. Question 3. How would the Dutch model vary from the Portuguese model? Both the Portuguese and Dutch sought control of the Indian Ocean trade, but their strategies, organizations, and underlying philosophies were completely different. The Portuguese operated like a royal crusading state, while the Dutch ran a profit-driven multinational corporation. This difference explains why the Dutch system lasted centuries longer and built the first truly modern global network. The Portuguese model was a state-run enterprise. Every expedition, fort, and trade was owned and operated directly by the Crown of Portugal. Decisions flowed downward through royal bureaucrats and viceroys in Goa. Profit was important, but religion, glory, and royal prestige were equal motivators. In contrast, the Dutch East India Company was a private joint stock corporation chartered by the Dutch Republic. It could raise capital, build armies, mint coins, and make treaties on its own authority, all with the goal of maximizing shareholder profit. The difference in organization and accountability gave the Dutch a huge advantage in efficiency and financing. The two powers also differed in their military and administrative strategy. The Portuguese relied on fortified trading outposts, Goa, Malacca, Hormuz, and Macau, connected by powerful but small fleets. Their empire was thin, a string of defensive bastions along sea routes. The viceroy in Goa had limited control over distant outposts, and corruption was rampant. The Dutch, on the other hand, combined military ruthlessness with corporate centralization. The Dutch East India Company built Batavia as a central headquarters, run like a company board. Governors General coordinated fleets, production, and intelligence. The Dutch, like the Portuguese, were not above brutality, but unlike the Portuguese, their violence served an economic rather than religious purpose. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Dutch model of joint stock corporate financing meant investors could pool money and share profits or losses, a truly revolutionary model. This allowed for large-scale capital mobilization and long-term planning. The Portuguese system, by contrast, depended entirely on royal treasury funding, which was limited and politically unstable. In essence, Portugal pioneered global empire building, but the Dutch perfected global capitalism, where the Portuguese ruled with cannon and cross. The Dutch ruled with contracts, shareholders, and cold math, and in doing so created the model for modern multinational commerce and trade. Question 4. Why were the Portuguese less successful than the Spanish in spreading Catholicism? Spain was far more successful than Portugal in spreading Catholicism because its empire was territorial, populous, and missionary driven, whereas Portugal's was maritime, commercial, and dispersed. Spain conquered vast, densely populated regions in the Americas, bringing millions under direct colonial rule. This allowed systematic evangelization through conquest, law, and education. Portugal, by contrast, held small coastal enclaves in Africa and Asia, trading posts rather than colonies, so it had limited authority to compel or sustain conversions. Spanish colonization involved settlers, clergy, and institutions that embedded Christianity in everyday life. The Portuguese Empire was a network of forts run by merchants and soldiers. There were few permanent communities to sustain churches and schools. Finally, in the Americas, indigenous religions lacked centralized institutions, making mass conversions easier. In Africa and Asia, however, the Portuguese faced powerful, literate, and deeply rooted faiths like Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, which resisted large scale conversion. Essentially, Spain spread Catholicism through conquest, settlement, and state church coordination, while Portugal's commercial empire and scattered outposts limited its missionary impact. Question 5. Why was the fall of the Yuan and the rise of the Ming dynasty a good thing for the Confucian scholar gentry? The Mongols of the Yuan dynasty were foreign conquerors who distrusted the traditional Chinese elite. They favored foreigners and non Confucian administrators, while excluding Han Chinese scholars from the top levels of government. The civil service examination system, the scholar gentry's main route to power, was suspended or limited. When the Ming dynasty, founded by the Chinese rebel leader Xu Yangshang, also known as the Hongwu Emperor, replaced the Yuan, it was a return to native rule and Confucian orthodoxy. The Ming positioned itself as the restorer of Chinese civilization after a period of barbarian rule, immediately rehabilitating the prestige of Confucianism and those who mastered it. Under the Ming, the civil service examinations, based on mastery of the Confucian classics, were fully reinstated and institutionalized. This system determined entry into government service, returning the scholar gentry to their traditional role as the bureaucratic and moral backbone of the state. Now, learning and moral virtue, in theory, mattered more than birth or ethnicity, the cornerstone of the Confucian meritocratic ideal. The reality, of course, was that the wealthy, educated elites had many advantages over non scholars, and the true meritocratic potential of the civil service system was, in practice, limited. The Ming emperors actively revived Neo Confucian philosophy as the official ideological foundation of governance. This made the scholar gentry not just administrators, but custodians of moral order. Their worldview became the state's worldview. The Yuan emphasis on pragmatic, non ideological administration was replaced by a moralized, ritual centered Confucian bureaucracy. The scholar gentry's social position became more stable than it had been under the Mongols. With the imperial examinations restored, local officials once again formed the link between state and village, performing tax collection, local mediation, and education. The Ming state relied on the gentry's literacy, moral authority, and local prestige, giving them both power and security. The fall of the Yuan and the rise of the Ming restored Confucian values, native rule, and the exam based bureaucracy, all of which directly empowered the gentry. They regained their roles as administrators, moral guides, and interpreters of orthodoxy, reversing a century of marginalization under the Mongols. The Ming restored not only Chinese rule, but the Confucian moral order, and with it, the privileged position of the scholar gentry. Question 6. Why did the Ming dynasty eventually abandon the voyages of Sheng He? The voyages of Sheng He traveled the entirety of the Asian coast from China to the Middle East and then far down the African coast. These voyages were spectacular, with massive ships carrying exotic goods from across the Indian Ocean. However, the voyages were immensely expensive. Sheng He commanded fleets of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, sailing as far as East Africa. These expeditions were funded directly by the imperial treasury, and while they brought back exotic goods and tribute, they produced little tangible economic profit. To Confucian bureaucrats, who prioritized agriculture and fiscal stability over commerce or exploration, this looked like a wasteful extravagance. By the 1430s, with pressing needs along the northern frontier, especially defense against renewed Mongol threats, the voyages seemed an unjustifiable drain on state resources. The Ming scholar gentry class, steeped in Neo-Confucian moralism, viewed the maritime expeditions with deep suspicion. They believed that proper government meant ensuring internal order, moral rectitude, and agrarian prosperity, not pursuing distant trade or adventure. To them, Sheng He's voyages distracted from the emperor's Confucian duties, associated the court with eunuchs who they distrusted, and violated the ideal of Middle Kingdom self-sufficiency. China should receive tribute, not seek it abroad. When the powerful eunuch faction that had championed Sheng He lost influence, the voyages lost their political backing. From the 1430s onward, Mongol raids and frontier defense consumed Ming attention and resources. Protecting the northern borders and later rebuilding the Great Wall became the top priority. A maritime empire offered prestige, but a secure frontier was a matter of survival. By mid-century, Ming policy turned decisively inward. Maritime trade was restricted under the Haixin laws, which sought to prevent piracy but also stifled private overseas trade. The once great fleets decayed, their shipyards dismantled, and their records systematically destroyed. This reflected an ideological retrenchment, a return to self-sufficiency, orthodoxy, and suspicion of foreign influence. In essence, the voyages were the product of an imperial imagination too grand for Confucian pragmatism. Once visionary Emperor Yongle died, his successors preferred stability over spectacle. China did not feel compelled to seek out the rest of the world. Such was their arrogance that they presumed their self-ascribed superiority would be enough to attract the world to them. Question 7. Describe the differences between the Jesuit approach to conversion and the Dominican Franciscan approach. Why were the Europeans ultimately unable to convert China in large numbers? The Jesuit approach emphasized accommodation and adaptation. The Jesuits, following the model established by Matteo Ricci, sought to adapt Christianity to Chinese culture rather than replace it. Ricci and his successors believed conversion would only succeed if Christianity was presented as compatible with Confucian moral philosophy. They learned Chinese, dressed as Confucian scholars, and translated Christian ideas using terms familiar to the Chinese, such as Tianshu, or Lord of Heaven. They tolerated ancestor veneration and Confucian rites, arguing these were civil, not religious practices, expressions of filial piety, not idolatry. Jesuits focused on elite conversion. They aimed to win over educated scholar officials who could influence society from the top down. Their strategy was intellectual and diplomatic. They emphasized science, mathematics, and astronomy, demonstrating European knowledge to impress Chinese scholars and the imperial court. As a result, the Jesuits earned prestige and a degree of imperial favor, especially under the Ming and early Qing emperors, serving as court astronomers and advisors. The Dominicans and Franciscans were appalled by the accommodating approach of the Jesuits. They insisted on doctrinal purity. Christianity must be practiced exactly as in Europe. They denounced ancestor worship and Confucian rites as pagan rites, not cultural customs. They emphasized mass conversions rather than elite persuasion, often targeting marginalized groups. To the Dominicans and Franciscans, Jesuit flexibility looked like heresy, and they accused Ricci's followers of corrupting the faith for personal gain. The dispute culminated in the Chinese rites controversy of the 17th and 18th centuries. The papal authorities sided with the Dominicans and Franciscans, forbidding Chinese Catholics from participating in Confucian or ancestral rites. The Kangxi emperor, who had initially tolerated and even respected the Jesuits, saw this as an insult to Chinese culture and sovereignty. In 1721, the emperor banned Christian missions altogether, calling the missionaries, quote, petty and narrow minded. This papal decision effectively ended the Jesuits' success in China. There were several deeper structural factors that limited conversion. Unlike the Americas, where indigenous empires were politically broken and demographically devastated, China was literate and culturally self confident. Its moral and philosophical systems, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, already addressed questions of ethics, cosmology, and social order. Christianity had little to offer that seemed new or necessary. Christianity also presented as foreign and politically suspect. Missionaries were tolerated as long as they served practical roles, but mass conversions would have implied divided loyalties between emperor and pope. Furthermore, the seemingly petty squabbling between the Catholic orders undermined missionary credibility. To Chinese observers, European Christians arguing over rituals seemed to reveal the internal incoherence of the religion itself. Finally, after the rules controversy, successive Qing emperors restricted or outlawed missionary activity. Christian communities survived underground, but never regained imperial favor. Ultimately, the resilience of Chinese civilization, the political nature of the imperial state, and European religious infighting meant that Christianity remained a minority faith in China, admired for its science, but otherwise rejected as a challenge to cultural sovereignty. Question 8. Contrast the Manchu or Qing approach to rule with the Mongol or Yuan approach. Why would the Manchu be more successful? Both the Mongols and the Manchus ruled as outsiders, but their approaches to governance, cultural adaptation, and relations with the Han Chinese majority were very different, and those differences explain the Qing's much greater success. The overall cultural approach of the Mongols was separation. They would rule apart from their subjects. The Mongols saw themselves as conquerors of, not participants in, Chinese civilization. They preserved a strict ethnic hierarchy, placing Mongols at the top, followed by non Mongol Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese. They often excluded Han Chinese from high office, relying instead on foreigners, Persians, Muslims, Central Asians, to administer the empire. The Mongols disdained Confucianism, favoring practical administration and military control. The Yuan court patronized Tibetan Buddhism rather than the traditional Chinese religious or philosophical institutions. The Mongols ruled above and outside the society they governed, tolerated but never trusted by their subjects. The Manchus, by contrast, ruled from within. Though they were ethnically distinct, they consciously adopted Chinese culture and Confucian statecraft to legitimize their rule. They retained key elements of Chinese bureaucracy, reinstated the civil service exams, and positioned themselves as true heirs to the mandate of heaven. The Qing emperors became Confucian philosopher kings, personally engaging in moral discourse, classical learning, and ritual observance. They allowed and even encouraged intermarriage of elites and local collaboration, and ensured the participation of Han Chinese scholars and officials at every level of government. The Manchus integrated themselves into the Chinese worldview rather than standing apart from it. The Mongols and the Manchu had divergent views on treatment of the Chinese people. The Mongols were suspicious and exploitative, treating China as a conquered possession, a resource to be exploited. Heavy taxation and forced labor were common. Mongol rulers distrusted the scholar gentry and restricted Confucian education, and the foreign nature of Mongol culture was increasingly resented, fueling rebellion and cultural alienation. The Manchus took a different position, one of patronage and co-optation. They understood that the key to legitimacy was to win the hearts and minds of the scholar gentry. They honored Confucian values, patronized scholars, and portrayed themselves as protectors of Chinese civilization. They eventually won the loyalty, or at least the acquiescence, of China's educated elite. Because they learned from the Mongols' mistakes, they blended in where the Mongols stood apart. They maintained their ethnic identity, but governed through Chinese norms, earning cooperation from the scholar gentry and legitimacy from heaven. The Mongols conquered China, the Manchus became China, and that made all the difference. Question 9. Why did Japan enter into a self-imposed isolation? Japan's self-imposed isolation, often called sakoku or closed country, began gradually in the late 1500s and was codified in the early 1600s under the Tokugawa shogunate. The policy wasn't mindless xenophobia, but a deliberate political strategy to preserve domestic stability, maintain Tokugawa control, and contain the disruptive effects of European trade, guns, and religion. In the late 1500s, Japan had just emerged from over 100 years of feudal conflict known as the Warring States period, during which regional warlords, known as daimyos, fought bitterly for dominance until Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan in 1603. Having restored order, the new regime was deeply suspicious of anything that could ignite another internal conflict. Foreign influences, especially European traders and missionaries, had empowered some daimyo and introduced new sources of wealth, weapons, and ideology that could threaten central control. Isolation was a way to freeze the social hierarchy and eliminate potentially destabilizing influences. Christian missionaries, mainly Jesuits and later Franciscans and Dominicans, arrived with Portuguese traders in the mid 1500s. At first, they were tolerated, even welcomed, because they facilitated access to European firearms and trade. But as conversions spread and the actions of converts and other Europeans became increasingly alarming, Tokugawa rulers became more vociferous in their rejection of the Europeans. Indeed, Toyotomo Hideyoshi himself saw Christianity as subservience, demanding as it did loyalty to a foreign spiritual authority. Christianity would ultimately be banned in 1587, missionaries expelled, and Japanese converts persecuted. Under the Tokugawa, those restrictions hardened into an absolute prohibition. It is important to note that Japan was never completely closed. The Tokugawa maintained trade with the Dutch in order to have access to Western scientific and technical knowledge, trade with China, and tributary contact with Korea and Okinawa. Isolation, in reality, really meant controlled engagement. Japan limited contact to maintain sovereignty on its own terms. In summary, Japan's isolation arose from a combination of domestic political consolidation after centuries of civil war, fear of Christianity and European imperialism, desire to control trade and prevent regional warlords from gaining power, and a Confucian ideology that valued stability over expansion. The Tokugawa shoguns weren't closing Japan out of ignorance, they were locking in their victory. Japan built walls not to exclude foreign influence, but to maintain a status quo that guaranteed domestic peace and stability.